Hello, Structeezy 1.7 is available and officially supporting Alpine.js. So if you want to learn how to build modern reactive components directly in bricks with very lightweight frameworks without using heavy frameworks like React or Vue, you're at the right place. So we're in bricks, but let's first have a look at the front end of our site. And these are the examples available directly from the Structeezy panel, slightly adapted for the last one. But first you have a component that is, I would say, the first component we usually demonstrate with any framework, which is a counter that we can increment and decrement by pressing buttons, and simply the text here reacts to the change in the variable. This one is a simple drop-down with a visibility that is toggled when clicking on the button. This is a clock with a timeout that will refresh the value every second. And the last one actually combines two examples from the Structeezy panel. The first one is a list of users that is fetched from an external API, and from this API we are creating user cards using a template that will be repeated automatically for each user. And this also includes a search field, and we can search, and it's a very simple search for the demo. It will search for the first letters of the username. So if I start typing a C, well, this will be filtered for users starting by C, then L, and then we have only two users. So this is the kind of components we can build with Structeezy together with Alpine.js. So let's have a look how it works, but just before we jump into the editor, a new feature available in Structeezy is this one. It's from your general preference panel. And as we are starting to have a few tabs, a few groups of elements available in Structeezy, you can choose, depending on your project, on what you are currently working on, to activate or deactivate each of these groups. So for example, if I'm not using MathML for my project, I can toggle it off, and this will not be loaded in Structeezy. So you can deactivate and activate them to match your needs. Okay, so back in the editor, I will refresh my editor, so my latest modifications from the dashboards are used in the editor. And if I open my panel, you can see that the MathML is not visible anymore. And another modification as I did, because we have a few tabs, is that they are scrollable. So if there are many of them, you can scroll to access each of the available tabs. So there is now this new Alpine.js tab with some base elements, and the list will increase based on your feedback and maybe the comments in this video. So if you have suggestions or if you have requests, just leave a comment in the video. And Alpine.js is supported through this tab, of course, but also in the parser you can parse code containing Alpine.js directive and magics directly from the parser. Okay, so let's start by trying to understand what Alpine.js is and what we can do with it. So let's clear all of it. I will keep only one of my rows as a container. So now it's completely empty. And you will need at least two things to create a component. So the first one is, of course, the library itself. So the first category in the Alpine.js tab, the CDN imports allow you to link the source libraries from the CDN. So you will need at least the core library. So let's add this one, and I will drag it at the top of my structure. One of the interests of Alpine.js is that it's very lightweight. I think that the whole library is something like 17 kilobytes. So it doesn't add a lot to your page. So now I have my script, so I can create Alpine.js components. And to create a component, I will need a root. The root is a container. By default, this one gives us a div. But what's important is that this div has an attribute of x-data. And this is what creates a component. So let's create a simple one, and I will modify my defaults. And for the value of this component, we need to give it an object. So in JavaScript, to create an object, you use curly braces, a pair of curly braces. And let's start by writing a simple text. So I will have a property of message with a colon, and this will have a value of hello Structeezy lovers. So now what can we do with this? Well, inside of my root, my component, let's add a text that's also a basic element, but it's pre-configured so you can easily use it with Alpine. And this has an attribute of xText, and the value will be what we want to give it. So by default, it's the message, and you can see that the text is written over there. So there's nothing very spectacular here, but this gives you the basic understanding of the way an Alpine.js component works. Inside of our root, the xData object, if you are familiar with the terminology of JavaScript frameworks, this will handle our component state. So let's say that our message is a property available in our component state. And if the value of our message property varies, then the text displayed by the component will vary. A way to demonstrate this could be to add to our component a text input. So let's add an input. And the input creates a text input. By default, I did configure it to be a search input because that's what we will use most often. But of course, we can change the placeholder to anything. Let's say this is a text value. And the important directive this time is the xModel directive. And what will xModel do is that this will link the value of our text input to a property from our state, from our xData. So if we want to update the message in our state, when we change the value in the text input, we will change the xModel to message, because this is how we did name it. And you can see that this did change the value in my text input. And as I did create a reactive component, now if I change the value in my text input, this should be reflected reactively in my text elements. So let's give it a try and change lovers to users, and you can see that I change the value in my input and it is immediately reflected in my element. And this is the way any framework works. React works this way, Vue works this way. You have a state, you update a state, and components depending on this state will adjust, will be re-rendered according to the state. And this is handled by the library. In our case, this is handled by Alpine.js. Okay, so now we understand how to create a component. That's pretty easy. And how to read from the state the value in our element and how to write to the state. Let's say, for example, that I want my text element here to be toggleable on and off. I can make it visible or I can make it invisible. So let's get back to our root element and modify our data. And in addition to our message, we will have an open property with a value of false to start with. So to start with, it will be invisible. And then let's add a button. So we can use our button, for example, and it is pre-configured with an event listener, a click listener. So this button has an x-on directive that will create an event listener, and then we have a colon and then the name of the event. So in this case it's click, so we want to listen to a click. And then the value will be an expression, or it's preset with a function named toggle, but in our case we will make something very simple. We'll say that open will be equal to the opposite of open. And in JavaScript, to define the opposite, we use the exclamation mark. Okay, so now we have a button, and by clicking on this button we will change the value of our open state. And now we need to tell this element that it should be visible when the state is open equals true, and invisible when the state is open equals false. And to do this, well, I could use this element, a container element. So maybe I can do this. I will, and actually this will be the opposite. I will use the container and I will slide my text inside of this container, because this container is preset with an xShow attribute that will manage the element visibility. And then I will simply tell that xShow is equals to open. So when open is true, it will be visible, and when open is false, it will be invisible. This element also has other attributes. You see that there is an event listener. On click outside, So that's useful for drop-downs or modals, for example, when you click outside of the element, open equals to false. And then by default, there is a display none applied. This is to avoid layout shifts when the page loads. Don't take care about it for now. So let's save. And this didn't reflect immediately the visibility, but let's refresh our front end. And you can see that the element is not visible, and hopefully when I click my button, it's visible. And I click again, you can see that it toggles visible and invisible. Okay, not sure, let's try, but if I refresh bricks, so it takes into account the new attributes, it should be reflected also in the editor. I'm not sure, so let's give it a try. Refresh the editor. And it works. If I click my button, it toggles the visibility, and click again, it's invisible. Okay. So we already have learned about the X data, the X text, the X on to add an event listener, and about the what was the last one? The last one, X show to toggle visibility. So that's already quite some useful information that we did use here. And with this, you can already create interesting components, toggling visibility of elements on your page, modifying values of elements on your page, and of course, having your components reactive as soon as the state is updated. But maybe, and this is interesting because we are in WordPress, we can do something interesting with WordPress. Maybe you have already heard about headless WordPress. These are cases when you use only the back end of WordPress as your CMS to manage content. And then you use the WordPress REST API to query data from the CMS and to render it in a completely custom application that can be made out of anything, pure HTML and JavaScript if you want, Vue, React, Astro, anything. But what's interesting, because we are using our page builder, currently we are using bricks together with Structeezy, and you will see that we can query our WordPress REST API from our page using an Alpine.js component as we did create. Okay, so that will be a bit more tricky. We can create something a bit similar to what we saw earlier with the example from the users cards queried from an external API. But this time we will query from our own website. So let's start afresh, and I will keep only my root for now. And I will go and modify my data. And I will do something very simple for now. I will keep only one property, and my property will be my posts, and it will be an empty array. And to define an empty array, we simply use a pair of square brackets. And then I will add another attribute And this attribute will be x-init. And what I want to do is that when my component initializes, I want to send a query to my WordPress REST API and get my posts in return. So let's fetch, and we want to fetch our website, and to make this fetch request dynamic, we will create a dynamic URL. So I will use a template literal. This is created with backticks. And with these backticks, first I will use a $sign and a pair of curly brackets. The first thing I want to get is my window.location.protocol. And this should return me something like HTTPS : with the colon included. Then I will add a // and then again a $sign, a pair of curly brackets, and this time I want my window.location.hostname. And this should give you whatever your current domain is. mydomain.com or mytestwebsite.local or anything you are currently working on. And now let's add a / wp-json / then we use the namespace, which is wp for WordPress, because we want to query directly WordPress. For example, Structeezy uses the API and has its own namespace. / the version, it will be version 2, and then the endpoint. And the endpoint we want to query is the posts. So hopefully this should return all our posts data. And then, then a pair of parentheses. With our response, we want to parse our response, so res.json. Then, with our data, we want that our post is equal to data. And hopefully, if I did spell everything properly, this should return us our posts. To check that, so let's add a text, and I want my text to have a value of json.stringify. This is a function that will create a string so we can display it on the screen from the JSON object returned by the API, and it will be stringify of my posts. Let's refresh so it is visible. And we saw it disappear after the fetch request was performed, meaning that something went wrong. So I probably wrote something wrong. So let's check again. I'm fetching my location. Okay, protocol. Of course, I must call the function, so I need a pair of parentheses. Okay. And we see that I get the response from my API. So of course it's a JSON object. It's not easy to read for us, but it's really easy for a machine. Maybe we can try to render this post. So for now I have only one. It's the default hello world, but let's try to render it, and I will take my text element is here, and I will simply change my attribute, and actually I want to render my post content. And to render my post content, I have only one post in my array, but the content is not plain text. The content is HTML. So the directive I will use is not the xtext this time, but it will be the x-HTML. The x-HTML directive updates the element inner HTML. Okay, so I will use the x-HTML. Visually, this doesn't change anything because we are rendering text as HTML, our stringified JSON, so it looks the same. But now my value will not be my stringified response anymore, but I will use my posts, and for now it's broken because it tells me that it's an object, of course, but I want the first element in my array, so I will use square brackets 1. Sorry, first element in an array is not 1, it's 0. So it's not undefined anymore, it's an object. And then I want to display my content, and actually content is not directly the result, it's again an object, and I want my rendered content, so content dot rendered, and then I get my post content rendered to the screen. So that's it for this video. Let's keep it short. The target was to give you an overview of what can be achieved with Alpine.js together with Structeezy in Bricks. So now you know how to add properties to your state, how to read from the state and update an element data, text for example, based on this state, how to write to the state. You even know how to hide and show an element, how to listen to an event, and you also know how to query from an API, and you even know how to query from the WordPress API, posts in our case. So this is a brand new site. We only have the default Hello World post, but you probably can imagine what can be done with it. And this will be the topic for a next video, where we will use a demo site with a few more posts, with content, with images, with more complex HTML, and we will see how we can query, how we can filter, how we can search from our post and display our result without querying the server, but using something a bit like a single page application directly built in Bricks with Alpine.js and Structeezy. So see you in the next video.